Ken Botnick is an internationally known book artist, designer, and design educator who came to Wellesley from Washington University, where he ran the Cannesburg Book Studio and led studio workshops in the design and production of books. Ken's work can be found in a list of collections too numerous for me to name here, but of course I'm going to just tell you a couple. The National Gallery of Art, the Getty Center for the Humanities, the Newberry Library, Princeton Rare Books, the Bodleian Library, and Wellesley's own special collections. He has published widely on the topic of book arts, recently about India, in a publication entitled, quote, Transvisuality, Dimensioning the Visual in a Visual Culture, unquote, with collaborator Ira Raja. At Wellesley, we had the good fortune to hear about Ken's work in India when he collaborated with the Davis Museum, hello Davis, on a panel about indigo last September, when Ken had been at Wellesley for the sum total of 2 weeks. Ken later traveled back to India, where he continued his collaboration with Indian artists in a traditional dyeing workshop. That same month, a one-man show of his work opened in conjunction with the Vienna Art Book Fair at, Ruth, you're going to have to help me, Gallery Bruch i Druck. Okay. Oh, thank you. In addition to his stature as an artist, Ken also thinks deeply about the form of the book, which he calls a stage for interdisciplinary thinking. At the Newhouse Center, he has been working on the book as lens, making books as a mode of inquiry. In this book, which promises to break new ground, Ken takes up the subject of the hand as a perceptual tool, among other topics, drawing from such diverse sources as Frank Wilson's Study the Hand, as well as poetry by Gary Snyder. I promised to let Ken tell you himself about his own work. That's why we are here after all. But what he might not tell you is what a joy it has been to have Ken at the Newhouse Center this year. He's given tirelessly of his knowledge and expertise to Wellesley faculty and students. He leads a faculty seminar at Special Collections with the support and the generous and knowledgeable Ruth Rogers. He has visited Catherine Ruffin's class and even hired, I believe it's one of your students, Catherine. Yes, hand up. Oh, yep, good. I have. What are you hired to do exactly?
That's a question for Ken.
Assistant.
Robin Siddle is going to be the new president of M-International.
Okay. Did you hear that? Robin Siddle will be the new president of M-International. Okay, thank you. But I'm not quite done. He has lent us some fine examples of his work on the wall that behind you, so please take time after the talk to have a look. Last but not least, a Saturday 3 weeks ago, Ken led a book-making workshop at the Weisman Foundry at Babson College. We had 25 Wellesley students who signed up and got themselves over to Babson on a Saturday. And what I hear is there's a long waiting list for the next one if we can pull it off. Right, Robin? Yeah. So I would say that it's his generosity with his time, his brain, and his hand that have made Ken Botnick an outstanding Mary L. Cornille Distinguished Professor for 2019-2020. Thank you, Ken.
Well, thank you, Eve. The pleasure is really all mine. I can't tell you how much I love being at Wellesley College. I have deep gratitude to Mary Cornille, of course, for his support to make this professorship a possibility. I have great affection for the Newhouse Center and for being my host family this year, and to Eve in particular. And it's particularly gratifying to be at a place that has such deep-seated appreciation and dedication to the study of book culture. There's so many different ways that it's thriving on campus. Catherine Ruffin's beautiful book lab, where she has wonderful students, Ruth's book history courses. It's really an amazing place to be. Particular gratitude to the Wellesley Special Collections, which has been acquiring my work for almost 20 years, probably. And it is, I think, one of the outstanding special collections internationally, especially in the contemporary book arts world. And, you know, collections are not just collected and assembled by colleges. They're built by curators. And over the years, I have worked with many, many fine curators. But I have to tell you that you have at Wellesley one of the very finest in Ruth Rogers. So I want to thank you, Ruth, for your really many and important contributions to this field. So thank you very much. This talk is arranged in two parts. The first part is talking, so you're going to be looking at this screen for about 15 minutes. But this is basically the way the Newhouse Fellows have been presenting their work, and so I thought I would do the same this year and participate in this presentation of a project that is in process. And so I will give you the outline of that project, and then the second half is using visuals from my book Diderot project that I believe speak to the points that I'm covering in this project. So bear with me at first, and I'll read through my outline. From my perspective, this is a particularly fertile period for artist books. Makers across the globe are producing compelling books fueled by experimentation with textuality, information design, and imaging technologies. A visit to Wellesley's special collections will quickly prove there is no single definition that could cover the diversity of work. But as an attempt, I'll offer this. The artist book is to the world of books as poetry is to the world of language. Form, structure, syntax, and metaphor are not required or expected to conform to convention. The defining characteristic of the artist book is that its authorship is the product of an interwovenness of concept, text, design, materiality, and production. Because this authorship is not derived solely from a written text, an artist book requires a simultaneous reading of its visual material and textual elements. I need to confess at the start my frustration with the term artist book. My first objection is that I identify as a designer, not as an artist. And as a designer, my first impulse is to consider usability and utility, how the book will be held, read, and function. And second, I reject the emphasis this term appears to place on outcome, privileging the object over the process. I know I'm not alone with this frustration, but as a field, we don't seem to be able to come up with anything better as a replacement, so I'll resort to this one. This talk is developed from my current project, a primer on the artist book as research method, drawn from my more than 40 years' experience as a designer, maker, and teacher. My hope is to illustrate a method where the book's authorship is derived from its making. It is an active engagement with the book taking place on multiple levels. We are so accustomed to books shaping our thinking through information, stories, and metaphor that when we actually make a book, it is a transformational experience, one that imparts agency. For this reason, I think of the book as an epistemic object. You could say that all handmade objects have a form of authorship inherent in their making. Throwing a pot is a beautiful experience, but a cup isn't filled with ideas. A book is. It is good when people make things, especially things that inspire them to think about their world. Almost 40 years ago, the introduction of the Macintosh seemed to predict the demise of the book, but the book continues to flourish. Is it a response to the inescapability of screen culture, an attempt to regain agency grounded in the object? Big technological shifts trigger cultural output. In the mid-19th century, the invention of photography seemed to foretell the death of painting. But painting didn't die. It found new modes of expression. The Industrial Revolution's low-quality mass production inspired members of the English Arts and Crafts Society to establish their own presses and to produce the book beautiful. And in the 1960s and 70s, the transition to offset printing made huge amounts of letterpress equipment available for next to nothing. Suddenly, a new generation of printer publishers, myself included, had the means of production to publish finely printed limited editions and did so for minimal investment. An overview of a long career affords me the luxury of being able to identify distinct working methods, working periods that shaped who I am. The first I consider my apprenticeship to the book arts, printing, papermaking, and binding at Red Osier Press in New York with my partner Steve Miller. Red Osier made what were referred to then as fine editions, but the mission of the press was to publish diverse contemporary writers, including Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, Robert Bly, Guy Davenport, and Octavio Paz. Our books also included original art by Nancy Spiro, Isamu Noguchi, and Larry Rivers, among others. The second period of my career is defined by my work at Yale University Press, managing design and production of the art and design books. Because my design training was in landscape architecture, I've never taken a class in typography or graphic design, don't tell anybody. Because my training was in landscape architecture and not graphic design, my time at Yale Press served as my graduate education. At the time, Yale was publishing books by influential graphic designers, Paul Rand, Bradbury Thompson, Dan Friedman, and it was through their work that I was introduced to the role of designer as author. I was also an adjunct instructor in typography at the School of Design and sat in on classes taught by design masters from around the world. I was in no way qualified for the job at Yale Press when I started, but I was an avid student in a rich environment. It is in the last 20 years that I began to embrace the role of designer as author. The first part of my career was shaped by the philosophy that the typographer-designer should be invisible on the page, that our responsibility was to the author's text. I had to shed that behavior to become more visible in my books and to embrace the role of author in order to discover the interrelationship of design and craft and a new form of authorship. This wasn't an easy undertaking after having published authors of such stature as the ones that I had at Red Osier. I will address my relationship to the artist book more fully in a few minutes when we look at my book, Diderot Project. Throughout my career, there's been the constant strain and stream of design and craft education. Teaching required me to frame foundational questions, and those questions have in turn shaped my studio work. A primary question concerns the interrelationship of design and craft. The steamroller of modernist specialization marginalized craft as a decorative and disposable commodity, eliminating it from art and design education. The role of craft in design education is a Bauhausian value I wholeheartedly embrace. In her beautiful essay, Thoughts on Design, Bauhaus master textile artist Annie Albers referred to craft's traditions of operation, the repetitive, sometimes boring tasks that are surprisingly generative. When our hands are engaged, ideas form at the edges of our attention. Consider how when we look for stars in the night sky, they appear brighter in our peripheral vision than when focusing directly at them. Ideas, too, are often brighter at the periphery. Making does, in fact, stimulate thinking. As an educator, I have noticed, with some alarm, a de-skilling taking place. Each new class arrives less experienced with hand tools and simple machines than the previous one. Unfamiliarity with tools separates us from an essential character of being human. Our hands are built to use tools to make things. The haptic sensation of working with our hands elicits a proprioceptive response. When we make things, the body is alive. Tools and machines function as extensions of our body, allowing us to shape materials we wouldn't otherwise be able to. We must think through the tool. Everything in the studio is a tool, even the unlikely materials, ink and paper. I was hired by Washington University in 1997 to establish the Kranzberg Book Studio from the ground up, its physical space and its curriculum. Though I was the director of the book studio, my appointment was in graphic design, which is a professional program at WashU. In the late 90s, it wasn't unusual to have students who planned for careers in publishing and book design, but that was rapidly changing. Increasingly, students were entering a professional world where they would never design for print, let alone books. I had to make a decision about the curriculum's relevance for art design students. Would the studio conform to a traditional skill-based book arts curriculum, which I felt might be a little bit narrow in spite of its value to them? Or could we become a center where students learned to integrate design and hand production as a part of their design thinking process? The hand was being replaced by the computer as a design tool, and this was a small way to restore it. The new curriculum meant lessening focus on precision skills in exchange for a new practice, less refined, maybe a bit messier, but much more vital. It felt like a risk worth taking. We were teaching students about the importance of tools and craft and simultaneously instilling in them the role of designer as author. Design schools and their students can be overly focused on creating professional portfolios. The work we did in the book studio didn't always conform to my colleagues' goals for their students' projects, but I felt comfortable training the students in this process-driven work. This was an opportunity to create a studio fueled by the mutuality of design and craft, grounded in a fairly simple method. In a nutshell, there are three primary steps to this method. In the first phase, the designer identifies their subject, a chair, for example, and asks questions about its chairness by assessing its constituent parts, its historical context, and its function. Identifying the question that fuels the inquiry is one of the biggest challenges, and it is most difficult to keep the question manageable in scope. A simple premise allows an expansive search. A complicated one quickly proves unwieldy and unworkable. The important thing to note here is that the tools we choose to conduct our search shape its outcome. In this case, the book is just not the outcome, but the tool itself. The second step is to make the research visual. This takes place at a much earlier stage, in fact, right away, than the young designer feels prepared for. Projects can become derailed if they spin too long in a whirlpool of research inside the designer's head. By making the work visual, design questions such as hierarchy, size, shape, color, and text-image relationships kick in and help the maker more clearly frame her subject. Authorship emerges when designer and researcher function as one to produce work shaped by the physicality of the book. The two-page frame of the page spread, for example, forces the designer-author to confront the seemingly simple question of what to show and what to tell. The designer pulls apart bits of their research to test how they function in concert and contrast with other elements. A page does not work like a painting. Meaning accumulates in successive layers or pages that couldn't have been predicted at the outset. The next phase involves finding the narrative thread in the sequentiality of the codex form. The book finds its form through expansion and elaboration. The more complex the information, the more it requires finding visual and conceptual balance through pacing, continuity, rhythm, clarity, ambiguity, and complexity. While there is a diversity of innovative forms an artist book can assume, and my project will explore many of them, at the heart of this project is a belief in the page-by-page experience of the codex as a model for memory and cognition. Each experience shaping the next, and in turn reconfigures what we already know. For examples of perfect narrative pacing, one need look no further than classic children's books. Goodnight Moon or A Snowy Day, for example. Masterful in their deceptive simplicity. Picture books are good models of how to achieve a visual poetry that balances text and image, and I refer to them regularly. And, importantly, picture books remind us of one of the best things a book can provide: delight. Delight is another casualty of design education because it is thought to be not serious enough to be of value in this modern world of ours. But one of the most important functions of design is to elicit delight in its user. Making books in this fashion is an iterative process, one I call making the book to discover the subject. The most foreign aspect of this is its slowness, an increasingly unfamiliar condition. Slowness runs counter to everything students know about their world of immediacy and short-term attention. The great problem of teaching students today solely on the computer is that the thing they're designing looks glossy and finished almost immediately, when framed and backlit so seductively. A few years ago, I saw on a teaching evaluation, on the last page where it asks anything to add about what you learned this semester, one of my students wrote, "Yes, I learned the definitions of the words sedulous and assiduous." For a designer, it is critical to ask where we derive delight and how we use it in our work. In my discussion of Diderot project, I will illustrate my research method and something about designing for complexity, and also where I find delight. So, 2009, I was with my students at Washington University in the special collections. I taught a course in the history of graphic design, and one of the things that we always did was go to special collections to see examples from the history of printing. And one of the examples that I used was the Encyclopedia of Diderot. And on one of those visits, one of my students said, well, it's great that the books are here because they'll be protected and kept away from the people that can damage them. And I said, actually, that's one function of a library, but it's not an important function of the library. And she said, well, what's the important thing? And I said, to be able to present it to you when you come so you can form new knowledge based in this book. And so I thought about that, and I thought, oh, that's a pretty good idea. I haven't tried that. And then I started to think, you know, I don't really know this book well enough to teach it successfully. And I've got to devise a method to really understand this massive project. 28 volumes, almost 25 years, 200 pounds of shelf weight. I weighed them. I had to get my head around this, and it was coming at a time when I was I knew that I could print another beautiful book. I understood how to make things well. And what I needed to do was to engage in a project that challenged me in ways that I had never encountered. And I also needed to take on a subject that people thought had been done to death, and that there was nothing new that one could add. And actually, a curator told me that very early on when he heard that I was working on Diderot. He just said, "Don't do it. It's, there's nothing new there to be found." But looking at the title page of the encyclopedia, one sees a really profound expression that is right here in the title, Arts et Métiers. That's the artisans, the métier, and the workshops. And I was so struck by Diderot placing that right on the damn title pages of all 28 volumes, placing artisans in the same realm as scientists, philosophers, and artists. And all of the, right away, I knew that there was something for me in this project. I didn't know where it was going to take me, but I knew there was something there. Now, it was the plates that really pulled me in. And if you haven't seen this book, these are, great big engravings, like full page always. And they're just spectacular examples of 18th century French engraving. And, I foolishly started this project thinking, I'm going to produce a book that has images that are printed as beautifully as these, which was really the dumbest thing I ever thought I could do. So I abandoned that pretty quickly. But these plates of natural history, anatomy, bugs and so forth, were the ones that really had grabbed my attention, as they're the most well-known of all of the plates. And I thought that's where my project was. And I started going to our special collections. They had a cart with the 11 plate volumes, 3,129 engravings. And they had put them on reserve for me. And I just made it my practice every week of going in with my camera, set up the tripod, and I started shooting the plates of the encyclopedia. And week by week, I would go back to my studio and I would upload all of my images to my computer, and I started categorizing, and I was using this as a way of shopping, as a way of looking at what I was looking at. And I realized that the camera was my tool. This was the fundamental recognition that I had figured out, that the lens, this is really where the book as lens idea came from, was I was going to discover this through the lens of my camera. The point was not to make beautiful photographs. The point was to find things in these engravings. And I really started to find things. I started to encounter things like this, these massive collections of tools. And of course, I have an obsession with tools, with hand tools. And I was fascinated at what was going on these pages. There are no captions. And when you go to the source in the text that references all these little figure numbers, most of the time it gives you almost no usable information. It might just be a name of something, or say a hammer. But it doesn't tell you how big, what it's made of, And so I was really fascinated that it was implying a whole way of reading that I hadn't quite encountered before. And it happens that during this time, I was making frequent trips to India. I had been on a Fulbright in 2005 and 2006 at the National Institute of Design, teaching typography workshops. And I continued to go each year and ran something called the Village India program for Washington University for a few years in rural Andhra Pradesh. But the energy to me was in the streets. I wasn't interested in what was going on in these the design schools of India. I was really interested in what these craftsmen were doing, and I started categorizing my pictures there as well. And I was looking to see how people organized things. You know, this impulse in these very street level, you know, things arranged on the sidewalk, the care that people took to organize and classify the tools that they were selling just was really interesting to me. I started to think about India as maybe the most innately design conscious culture I had ever encountered. You see common people every day working with pattern and color in ways that is remarkably inventive and authentic. I know authentic is a loaded word, but I'm going to use it anyway. I also started looking at these signs. Now, the hand-painted signs of India are also one of the things every designer that goes to India falls in love with, the hand-painted signs, and they're spectacular things. But I was not looking at them so much as just wonderful, funky ways of showing signs. I was looking at them for what they represented in the way that the sign painters were visualizing a framed space. And they seemed to be moving so fluidly between these flattened representations and then dimensional and then, you know, weird perspectival, all within the same frame. They had this incredible freedom of changing the multiple points of entry into these signs that I just felt were spectacular. So I was learning something about composition and just freeing up and spontaneity and improvisation in a graphic sense that I had never really felt as a book designer, because book designers are, you know, control freaks and not the most fluid people that you've ever met. So I started writing about this design, and I coined this term subtle technology to talk about what was going on in the streets of India that I was seeing. And with my partner, my writing partner, Ira Raja, we co-authored now about 6 articles on different aspects of Indian artisanship for peer-reviewed journals. Those of you who are academics here understand peer-reviewed journals very well. It was a new thing for me. I had never understood that as a discipline. So in a strange way, India actually created me as a disciplined writer. And it was an amazing leap that I was able to overcome, having published the likes of Octavio Paz. It's not easy to think of yourself in the same realm as an author. But the amazing thing about these plates is out of these over 3,000, more than half of them turn out to be about making things. Diderot was very clear not to show finished products. There's almost nowhere do you see anything that's actually a thing that's finally, you know, a realized thing. It's all about process. And the reason it's all about process is that Diderot is very clear in his writing in the preliminary discourse to the Encyclopedia. I don't know if Hélène is still here, but I was intimidated to try to pronounce that in front of her. I did that for you, though. But he was very clear about this process of correlation that he was trying to advance in his readership, that the value of this encyclopedia was as an object to use to generate more knowledge, to be able to expand out into new territory and make your own correlations. And I found that to be a very profound concept. But the other thing about the correlation that I think is so interesting is in the reading of these plates that is required, because up at the top, it's a little counterintuitive. They show these vignettes. This one is of a book bindery. They show these vignettes that are highly complex visual stories. They show the place that things are being made, but they're the smallest thing on the page. Beneath that, below that, are all these tools floating in this white space. In fact, all these things are being used up there. but you have to find them in the image. And so I thought, that's a really interesting thing. If you're trying to inspire people to make more things, you show them. And if you're worried about what scale that thing is, you find it up in the image. And there was this stuff was everywhere. I was just kind of exploding with this stuff. These workshops are amazing. On the left is a stone cutting place that is in the architecture section. In the middle is a basket maker, and on the right is the balancier, the maker of balances that everybody seemed to have at that time. And so you can see three distinct areas for the métier to be working in. The stonemason works in a stone yard. The basket guys, poor basket guys, have to work down in a basement, but they're making some giant basket to hold that statue, and there's a big conversation that's going on. And then the balancier has this walk-up trade. There's a window onto the street where they can sell their stuff. And so I was just fascinated with this form of, I was not only understanding things about the makers. A lot of these makers are pictured, they look like young boys. They have kind of these ripped bodies, but then they're these childlike faces. Well, that's the way they were. They were young. They were kids, and they'd worked hard, and they got used up at an early age. So I found myself, my photography starting to move into these plates and picking out just little things, that, for instance. And I was making big catalogs of buckets and barrels and hands and hammers and all of this stuff. And I'll go back to this. There are two kind of ur tools. I call them the ur tools of the Encyclopedia. And one is the hammer, which occurs everywhere in millions of different forms. It's amazing, astounding to see how many different kinds of hammers, because they were making them as they needed them. And the other is the divider, this compass-like thing that is up at the top. So you have these tool things. You have the blunt force of the hammer, the thing that extends the action of the hand and the arm. And you have this measuring device, this informational device. So information is always, our ability to gather information is always changing, but blunt force remains blunt force. And maybe that's how we ended up with Trump. But so the hand, and you'll see these floating hands. I love that image because it's actually, I think Lewis Mumford wrote about this, that it's actually the earliest form of manipulating material is twisting cord to make it stronger. And there's something about that image that struck me so deeply that I had to adapt it. I'll show you in a minute. So we have the traditions of operations. I was looking very closely at these guys. A lot of the characters in the encyclopedia became kind of my friends. You can see a lot of them up there in one of the prints. And I had my method. I had these subject areas that seemed to be breaking out pretty cleanly in tools and objects, craft, hands, and the senses. And those are the things that were driving my work up until that point, my work in India. And they started to really feel like they matched up with the work in the encyclopedia. Now, I have to tell you that early on in this project, I looked into the card catalog, as we all do, and I saw this mountain of books on Diderot and the encyclopedia. And I thought, the world doesn't need another book about the encyclopedia. I need to figure out what I'm going to do, and my book has to be me and Diderot having a conversation. It has to speak across generations and bring to it an intimacy that I haven't found in the other work. So I purposely did, I did exactly what you're not supposed to do. I didn't read any of the literature on the encyclopedia because, God forbid, I should get some education about it. But I had my own process. And in the preliminary discourse, there is this magnificent piece of information design, the système figuré, that is the map of the system of knowledge that Diderot and D'Alembert came up with to organize the contents of the encyclopedia. And his was the three categories were memory, reason, and the imagination. They worked perfectly with my hand, tool, and senses. I was ready to go. And once I saw this map of this system, I knew that I was on to something. At that point, I started to look a lot at Diderot's writing and started to pull it into my pages and understand that that was my base component, was the bits of the plates and the extractions of his short articles. I don't know if this is a mistaken take on Diderot or not, but I felt like the reason that the encyclopedia was considered to be such a dangerous document in the French Enlightenment, maybe led to the French Revolution of several years later. His call, he was an anti-religionist, he was an anti-monarchist. I felt like he was calling for a degree of transparency in society. And so I thought, paper can be transparent, ink can be transparent. Here's my visual metaphor. This is where I'm going to enter into this project. Transparency is going to be a fundamental device of this project. And that triggered a huge amount of experimentation. This is an example of the kind of work I was doing with the transparent paper. This is the very beginning, the half title. And I was constantly playing with opacity, transparency, degrees of those two things, and what role this transparency could actually play, not just as a sexy material, but as a thing that really meant something in the reading of the book. And the page turn always transforms the material. And this is a thing, these big squares are printed on the back side of the sheet, so when you turn the page, everything, because it's metallic ink, everything comes alive. The buckets, forming them into new patterns of thinking, of stimulation, the way the brain works, and constantly making patterns and of the material that stimulates it was really also another aspect of this. Another pattern was this kind of recurring mantra throughout the book of these encyclopedia visual constructs, these typographic constructs, because I think of books primarily right off the bat as venues for typography. I'm always looking at ways that type can interpret the meaning of a thing. And so this mantra keeps coming back at different points in the book, usually at the beginning or the end of a section. And it has a number of purposes. Its style changes. It's printed, 12 or 13 times in the book. It's never printed the same way twice. It changes its typographic style. But it's also a kind of a meditation on the fact that paper-written encyclopedias will never happen again. And that for people of my generation who sat in their dens and growing up with the World Book Encyclopedia on their laps doing their homework, this is really, this is stable. This is something that doesn't just kind of disappear the next time you go on Wikipedia. This is like really material that you can go back to. So I started to think about stability and transformation, and that this became a reflection of that. I wanted to go big with typography and to see what I could get out of it. I happened on this beautiful typeface, Walbaum Italic, early on. It had a certain kind of grace, but also presence on the page. And on the left-hand side, you see part of an engraving of the interior of a windmill for grinding flour. And what I needed was a typography that could stand up to these images. I wanted this book to feel like when you open this page spread, you first went to the type, not the image, because the image was kind of a too easy thing. The other thing was the blackness of these pages. I had a lot of black paper in the shop for some reason. I was experimenting with these plates. I realized just simply by taking the plate and inverting it silver on black, I could get this kind of negative feeling to the reading of it, and could also get it to mean something slightly different in that way. So all the pages that you see, the dark pages where they have something light on them, there's no white ink used in this. It's all silver and transparent. But when I did this Diderot construction was actually one of the first things I did in the entire book. As a book designer, you're supposed to design the whole book and then go into production. This book has 150 pages, and no two of them are the same. And I didn't know where I was going with it. I didn't know how long it was going to be. I was writing and editing the next signature as I was producing the previous one. So that was part of the challenge to my system, to see if I could actually get away with that. When you design a book, it's filled with all these rules, millions of rules, do this, do that, do this. There was only really one rule in this, and that was about establishing kind of a horizon at the top of the page, and that was it. Everything else just kind of happened. So in this case, in some of these pages, like here, I realized you could see through 4 layers. I was designing 4 layers deep into the book, and it was just tremendously exciting for me to be able to think like that. So this is a sequence there. The book is like a constantly looping sequence. There are all these little sequences that keep forming patterns of, I hope, meaning for the reader. And so this opening 10-page sequence starts like this. The gold is printed on this side, and you can't tell, but it's very shiny. And then the muted side is the one I really wanted. And I wanted this kind of peel away with the residue that happens in old books of engravings where the ink offsets and stains, the oil stains. And then you move into this kind of table of contents where I discuss these 3 sections. There's the 3rd section. And again, I hope you can see this, yeah. So the material that is coming on the next page is designed in concert with what's designed on this page. So there's a visual composition that happens there that when you turn the page changes entirely again because what you see on the previous page. So this is part of that whole thing about memory and cognition is like constantly shaping and reshaping what you thought you knew, how you predict what you're going to experience. That's what I was really trying to get at with this book. The typography of the 3 sections, each section has its own kind of signature. So the first section being on the hand has this kind of gentle curving quality that is almost like, I kept thinking about clay. If you just squeeze it in your hand, what you get in terms of that curvature. Of course, none of the curvatures are the same. They're all kind of misaligned in a way. But when I design pages like this, I don't design around the shape of the type. I design around the shape of the space. I use the type to change, to transform the space of the page. And that's one of the most difficult things to actually come to grips with as a typographer is how you can transform the space of the page. In the tools section, because it's tools and machines, there's something much more precise and sharp in the compositional quality. And then in the senses, things kind of blend, and I start to challenge the reading of the things. And I should say that in this case, you can't tell from this slide, I don't think, but some of that is Diderot's writing, and some of that is my writing. And the contemporary writing, mine and up to 40 different authors that I pulled into this thing, they don't know that, are all done in sans serif, and then Diderot is always kept in the serif type, the Walbaum. So the readability of these pages is actually quite, I think, easy and and beautiful. And then there's another part of the way that this is working in the senses section about, how to think about visual systems and so forth. Hard to see, I know, I'm sorry, but upper right-hand corner, can you tell those the hands twisting the fibers? I started my career as a paper maker many years ago at the University of Wisconsin, and continued that in New York at Dieudonné Press and Paper, and went back to Dieudonné after years of not working with them, just because I didn't have the time to make my own paper anymore. And I worked with Paul Wong to make these 3 signature watermarks. So there's one watermark for each section of the book. And this one is about the hands. There's one with the divider. I'm sorry, those are really very faint. And then, I don't know if can you even see that? Yeah. So the beetle that you saw before sitting, he's actually here. The rhinoceros beetle is the watermark. And this is, the census section is the 3rd section. It's the last one I came to in the book. I knew I wanted the beetle. He's the strongest animal on Earth. He can lift 800 times. She can lift 800 times her weight. And I was fascinated by the form of that beetle. But I was also fascinated by that guy who you saw in an earlier plate. He was eviscerated. Well, to me, he always looked like he was dreaming. So I just had him at the bottom of the page. I decided I have to couple him dreaming with that beetle. And then, of course, if you do that, you have to have that first line of the metamorphosis from Kafka. So that's how that works. Section on the hand, Eve talked about Frank Wilson, genius writer, talks about the hand and brain merging. Hand is brain, brain is hand. The tool section, about the hammer. There's a little quote from Gary Snyder's poem, Axe Handles, when making an axe. What does he say? Ray?
To the man with a hammer every
No. This one, it says, when making an axe handle.
The pattern is not far off.
Right. Love that. And then the divider. A little typology of these dividers. And then this is the next page of that. And this is how that opens up. Now that silver that you see in there is the back side of that. So this was an amazing thing that I discovered. That silver ink has so much black in it, it's probably 50% black, that when you see it through the filter of the paper filters out the reflective metallic quality. And what you get is, in a way, a kind of a sense of the true color of that ink, which I just loved. So these things are printed in the same silver as this, but the paper is separating the two. That sheet went through the press 10 times. And each time has to be hung up and dried for 24 hours before you can do anything with it. That was really... And then there are some little visual essays that are exciting to me. This is one about the nature of design. I'm really fascinated by vessels, that a vessel is designed around the negative space that it contains. It's supposed to carry something. That's another quality of design that I think is universal to whatever you're designing. And so this one is just a beautiful, I think, meditation on the nature of baskets, of holding things, of this, the diversity. So, but everything on here starts with a B. So it's buckets, barrels, baskets, a bench. A bench is a tool in a studio. Anybody who has a studio knows how much they count on their furniture. And then, of course, these are the punches, the counterforms for the letter B, that also are a little essay in positive and negative values of design work. Mr. Foucault from The Order of Things, quoted over there. And then there are sequences that happen. Upper left is the 6 simple machines from Greek philosophy. There's the lever, the wheel and axle, the pulley, the screw, the inclined plane, and then the text is actually the wedge. Below that, or no, to the right of that, you see improvements in power, human power, animal power. Then lower left, wind and water. And then on the right, there's a little visual essay and textual essay from Lewis Mumford on the nature of time, how the clock changed society so radically. I love this image of this guy. I knew I was getting near the end. The whole point of this was to have it ready for the Codex Book Fair in Berkeley in 2015 in February. I knew I had to finish, and I felt like this poor guy, you know, out hunting for birds, getting to the end. And so that was the end of that. Now, this quote, I don't know if anybody has come across this quote by Roland Barthes, but it's a beautiful, Ellen, you know this quote. Yeah, it's a beautiful concept. And when I saw this, I realized that it not only described my teaching phases, but it described my studio phases extremely well. And, you know, you start out as a craftsperson, you do what you know, and then you do what you have, figure out ways that you can do what you don't know in the name of research. But then when you get to the elder stage, where I think I am now, I don't feel like that mentally, but you start to have this wonderful thing that he calls unlearning. And, you know, when I left teaching at WashU, I had never been as in love with teaching as I was my last semester. I loved it. And somebody said, well, then why are you leaving? And I said, well, it's a great time to leave. You know, it's like, I'd rather leave when I loved it than when I didn't. But the unlearning part and that bit that he has in there about a lot of flavor, just, I love that idea. And I feel like that's where I am right now with my personal work, is this work in India is another one of these projects where I've decided just to challenge, to throw out all the rules for how you make a book, and to go ahead and dye all this paper, have it folded, cut, you know, to page size, everything beforehand, dye the stuff, and wonder how to make a book out of it. So that's my great unlearning, and thank you.
So I think we have time for questions. Fire away. Or comments?
Yes.
I was just wondering, I think I missed it, if you could say a little bit more, sorry, I lost my voice. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, you had talked earlier about the idea of book as epistemic object, and if you could just say a little bit more about how you were thinking about that. Maybe you said it and I missed it, but...
Well, it's primarily in the way that it comes to represent a way of knowing a subject. And that that way, for me, is making it. So there's a discovery of subject through the process, the iterative process of the making of the book. That's basically what, I wish I had something more profound to say than that, but that's really what it comes down to for me. And, you know, I think it's, I used to do this with my students all the time. We'd get into the first day of a book design class, and I'd give them a prompt for the project, and I'd say, okay, the book dummy is due by the end of the studio. And, you know, they'd say, well, how can we make a book? We don't know what it is yet. And I'd say, of course you don't, because you haven't made it. And, you know, you have to be willing to make it many, many, many times. I mean, that Diderot book, there are mountains of paper that got not used. You know, that's fine. But I don't know if that's enough.
Can you describe what you mean by making a book? Are you talking about literally folding pieces?
I'm talking about making it as accessible and simple as possible by just folding paper and pencil marks and thinking about the pacing and making it physical immediately. Make it physical, make it visual. Just, do not, it doesn't have to be poured, a lot of novelists will say that they're writing their book to figure out who their characters are. And I feel the same way. And certainly there are enough people in here who have written academic books who understand that maybe the thing you ended up with is not what you thought at the beginning. And I feel very akin to that. It's just in the way that I work is a very physical, direct way. Yes?
So thank you, that was really fascinating, and I'm really glad to have heard you take us through that way. And I'm thinking about the encyclopedia as the ultimate collaborative endeavor. To think that it's true that Diderot was the editor with D'Alembert, but that really it was this incredible group effort to write these entries. And yet your relationship to it seems to be so much more like a conversation between you and Diderot, and it's the Diderot book. So I wonder for the role of collaboration in your thinking, or why it was important to think about Diderot as the person you're having a conversation with.
That's a really good point, because he had his whole cohort of philosophers. Yeah. So at the beginning, I was actually going there with a lot of these different, Rousseau and all of these wonderful people that had contributed to the project. And he always called it a project. That was the wonderful thing. That's why he always referred to it as a project, which to me gives it a very active profile. But he was the one, for me, who made comments about craft, about the importance of the hand. Those were his articles that I kept referring to. And after a while, it was obvious that it was him. And it was the two of us. Of course, I brought along, Foucault and Barthes and everybody else to be on my side. But it was, I had to focus. And it was for that reason.
So since you mentioned Foucault, I just wanted to push you a little bit to say more about the order of things and about the argument that Foucault makes there about the classical age and the classical episteme, in which he argues that in that period, and I think the Encyclopedia is the perfect example of it, to represent something so that it was fully visible was to know it. And he argues that then was replaced by a different understanding of knowledge. And, I felt as though one of the just really remarkable and beautiful things about your book, which I was fortunate enough to see in special collections, thank you, Liz, was that at the same time it makes things intensely visible, but it also relies a great deal on invisibility, on semi-transparency, on things is kind of that sometimes there is an effect of things vanishing, in the silver ink on the black. So I just wondering, do you think that it's still possible for us to live in an age or to inhabit a moment in which to see something is to know it? Or do you think that we can no longer think of knowledge in that way, and that we have to look deeper, to look for something kind of behind it and ask about origins and think about what is invisible?
Well, I think I'd be out of my depth if I tried to talk Foucault with you. But I will say that quality of things being, I won't say unstable, but the presence of a thing on the page is really played with that concept of the materiality of the thing through the transparency of those inks and papers. I was always curious about how things worked, not just in their their formal presentation of the engraving, but what happens when you turn them over. And in fact, there's one moment that there's a bakery scene. And when you turn that page, in the open scene, like in that little vignette, there's a guy who's obviously a boss speaking to a man who's obviously a slave, shirt off, African. And I was so fascinated by that. And when I put them across the page from each other and in the gutter, and when you turn the page, it's the African who's kind of the superior figure to the guy. And so those are the kinds of things that you can play with in the book, the instability of what you think you're looking at, right? And so those were things, yes. But that empirical understanding of a thing, my Indian friends were saying, what are you messing with these stupid idiots from France? Nobody cares about that work anymore. It's old, it's outmoded, and I found, tremendous vibrancy, and I guess I'm kind of an empiricist myself, I don't know. There's actually a friend of ours from Germany, Sabina Golda, has a beautiful series of pamphlets called Empirical Questions that are they are actually the perfect illustration of the method that I was talking about for you. Ruth, you don't have them yet. It's new, but I saw them, and they're really cool. So I don't know if that answers your anything. But thank you for that comment about the book. I really appreciate that. Yes? Yes.
And you partially answered it, but I'm going to push back a little bit on your choice of the codex form, which you said was a model for memory and cognition, and therefore you kind of, it sounds like you, I don't want to say default to it, but you use the codex as a starting point. And one of the things that I often talk about with my book students is this idea that the form of the book needs to emerge from the content. And so you're clearly favoring starting with a form because you have a predilection for how it sort of is a metaphor for memory and stuff like that. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, I almost always get them to start there, but they don't have to finish there.
Why do you get them?
Because it's a thought experiment. If I get them too invested in the function of a kind of my experience with my book design students is that they want to make a thing that's never been made before, or they want to make a thing that does all this stuff. And I'm trying to get them to focus on the thing being derived from the content. And I find this tool, this as a way of organizing content so powerful and simple that where they want to take it after that is great.
So you start with it as a constraint that you feel like they can work within.
Constraints are fabulous. I love constraints. Now, personally, not everything I've done is in codex form, but I gave a talk and curator, they had a kind of a pre-talk, and they had the plate volumes out, and they're big things, and my book is a very personal-sized thing. And she said, I think it's a very, she called it brave choice for you to have, to make it as small as it is. And, I said, there's the practicality of, paper is really expensive. It's 150 pages and 70 copies. But more importantly than that is I designed for somebody holding that thing. That's the person I want. And if I lose that scale relationship, I kind of lose my bearings. And it's one of the things, it's a limitation in my practice probably, but it's one of the reasons why I kind of stay away from the cool structures, and I love those things, but I have difficulty making them. And I know plenty of people that make them really well.
And your students like them making.
They make a lot of goofy things. Yes, Phyllis?
Thank you for a great presentation, and one of the things I loved about what you did was kind of show us something about the orchestration of all these possible decisions.
and then to attend to which ones and
Right.
how they can come together. But I wonder if you might talk to us a little bit about your ideas about the multiple. Because
Oh, yes.
conceptually, your endeavor could end up with just one that is truly it. But you're making these decisions based on the idea that they'll be repeated at least 70 times correctly, right? More than that to get to
Yeah.
70. So could you talk a little bit about multiplicity in this particular meeting?
That's a really profound question. And, I know you have invested in the multiple as much as I have. I find tremendous, I won't say it's easy to make a thing once, but it's too seductive to make a thing that can't really be repeated. Now, I should really back that statement way back. There are my favorite books, the 20th century, like Diderot's Snow, for instance, which is a completely impossible, you could never reproduce that book, and it's just a spectacular thing. And, he's one of those geniuses that could produce an object like that needs to be in the world. But training people, much like, in using the structure of the codex, training people to think through the tools and the machines available to them that are required to make these reproductions, to reproduce the thing. It's fine, to say, okay, you could make that thing once, but having to think through the process of repeating it. And then the beautiful thing that they never think about, that you have to take somebody through the whole process with, is getting them to stand there and do it. And it is so productive to thinking, you mean I have to do this thing 20 times? Yes. And, listen to some music and just really enjoy the process, and suddenly lights start going off. If you do the thing once, you think of that as the finite thing. If you do the thing multiple times, you see it as a kind of an extension into space. I swear to God, that's the way I think about it. And it's just so important. The other thing about the multiple is that I'm always trying to get students to understand that they are participating in this form as part of book history. They are publishers. Publishers have responsibilities, but they also have to make a thing that they are not going to be standing next to explaining to the reader. They have to make the object that stands by itself. And that's critical, because I don't know if you've been in any art critiques lately, but students do have a tendency to want to explain. And I'm not interested in that. I want that, I'm a good reader. I want that thing to speak to me. And I think that comes from the discipline of making multiples. I think that's really at the heart of the issue here. Thank you for asking that. That's a really important question. Yes?
Since we're talking about reproducibility, you said that the camera was your tool for the Diderot project. And I wonder if you could just tell us more about your experience of photographic looking, and if it evolved throughout the project, and if it has affected you in your looking and learning of the world since the project.
Oh, it affected me profoundly. I'll talk about India, actually. I was when I was running this Village India program. It's July, it's Andhra Pradesh, it's monsoon. You're in the middle of really jungles and rice paddies. I had to make a trip into a nearby town that took about 45 minutes, hair-raising drives. Driving in India is the worst thing ever, even under the best conditions. But this was really, truly awful. And my driver was assigned to me for the whole 5 weeks that I was there. And he didn't like to use his headlamps because it would burn them out. And he didn't like to use the wipers because they would be used up. And it's raining and it's dark. And there's every kind of life you could possibly imagine happening on the roads right there. And we are zooming down these roads. And I was begging him to slow down, and he would not slow down. So at one point, there was a herd of buffaloes ahead of us. And I took my camera and I just held it out the window, because you couldn't shoot through the window, it was all wet. So I held it out here and I started shooting. And he slowed down because he thought I was working. And so I pulled the camera in and he sped up. And we got to another thing and I put it out and he slowed down. So I thought, the camera's my tool to get this guy to slow down. So, but I had no hope for these pictures, but I took them back and I plugged them into my computer. I popped them into my computer and I looked at these pictures. Ruth has this book.
Special Collections has
Yeah. Ruth has protectorship of this book, The Road at Night, and there's all this motion blur and kind of strange placement in the frame. And it is so much more about the nature of India than anything that I perfectly focused and framed. It just has all the spontaneity and the craziness of this trip. And I learned a lot from that experience. And actually, there were things I learned even from putting the photographs, from ordering the photographs in the narrative of this codex about this, what I was looking at, that I hadn't recognized until that point, until I made a book out of it. And so that's one example of how I've kind of evolved in my thinking about the use of the camera. Probably enough talking from me.
Gosh, yes, enough? We done?